My name is John Fenn. I'm the head of research and programs at the American Folklife Center here at the Library of Congress. And on behalf of our director, Nicole Saylor, and the entire staff at the center, I'd like to welcome you to today's Botkin presentation by Dr. Lisa Rathje, and I'll get to her in a second. The Botkin lectures allow us to highlight the work of leading minds in the disciplines of folklore, ethnomusicology, oral history, and cultural documentation, while enhancing and expanding our collections here at the center. The Botkin lectures are an important part of the acquisition activities for both the center and the library. Each lecture is video recorded, cataloged, and then posted to the library's website, where it will be freely available throughout the world. So please remember to turn off your phones or other noise-making devices at this moment. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Lisa Rathje, Executive Director of the prominent folklore and education nonprofit Local Learning, the National Network for Folk Arts in Education. Dr. Rathje received a PhD in English from the University of Missouri, and in her role at Local Learning, she co-edits the peer-reviewed Multimedia Journal of Folklore and Education, directs teacher and artist training institutes throughout the United States, and advocates for the inclusion of culture in diverse learning spaces. And that's all in her free time. A nationally sought consultant on education and folklore, she is also involved in the library's premier educational program, Teaching with Primary Sources. Shout out to all our colleagues from that office, through the Teaching with Ethnographic and Oral History Collections project that she leads. Dr. Rathje has taught courses on cultural partnerships and fieldwork in Goucher College's Master in Cultural Sustainability in the house degree program, has multiple publication and film credits, and serves on the Arts Education Partnership National Advisory Board. I'll close by noting that this is not her first Botkin appearance. In 2023, Lisa joined folklorist and Local Learning founder Patty Bowman in presenting Teaching Culture, Teaching Culturally, the Significance of Folklife Education in the Schools, and that is available online. Finally, this Botkin lecture is part of the American Folklife Center's 50th anniversary celebration. We are delighted to feature programming that highlights and celebrates our sister organizations like Local Learning involved in promoting the educational use of archival collections. Again, thank you for coming to today's event, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Lisa Rathje.
Thank you, John, and thank you, American Folklife Center, for having me here today. I mean, this is such an honor to be here, to be sharing. But let me be clear from the very beginning, I am sharing a team project, a team effort, and we'll be hopefully shouting out people as we go. So thank you. So I want to start by saying my son, who's actually here today, recently visited Costa Rica through a high school field lab supported by his public high school. The students were all instructed to leave their devices at home. This trip was offline. As we celebrate with the American Folklife Center 50 years of service to the American people, I am thinking deeply about the many technologies, eras, and especially stories that this space caretakes for all of us. And as we were thinking about learning through primary sources today, it provides one point of entry to understanding teaching and learning with today's students. The value of unmediated experiences from which a learner must derive meaning matters more than ever as we find ourselves with fewer opportunities to practice this skill. From texts and curricula designed to tell students what they need to pass the test, to AI supporting writing, thinking, even decision-making, we arrive at my first point. We know how to offer students an opportunity to build critical muscles for learning. It is through teaching with folk sources. So here's my premise. When Local Learning and our partners began to assess the American Folklife Center archive for materials that might resonate for educators, we became aware that even the most locally oriented item could offer opportunities for learning beyond the place, community, and culture from which it came. Consider hopscotch. And this is a Library of Congress image. As an icebreaker, I will often have people draw their hopscotch boards to start a discussion of the different ways we played this game or other jumping or throwing rock games. Simon Lichtman has written about the game of hopscotch at his school program in Jerusalem. He describes how the game creates space for learning between Jewish and Arab children as they share game variations shaped by religion or region. By using folklore and its understanding of variation, we make abstract terms like similar and different less abstract. As Linda Defenbaugh notes, when teachers use folk life education activities to direct students' attention to noticing similarities and differences and patterning within these, teachers can be more deliberative in advancing student understanding of the complexities of culture and its processes at work in their lives. Now students have tools to analyze that move them beyond right or wrong. You don't play that right. Good or bad. Now truth becomes more nuanced within a frame of multiple perspectives, particularly when building students' capacity for understanding across differences, including cultural difference. This scaffolding that centers asset-based learning proves powerful. Additionally, treating play and other cultural assets that we can discover through primary sources as serious text allows us to ask ourselves and our students to engage in analysis collaboratively. There are caveats to this statement, of course. Stories of appropriation, removal of safeguards for private cultural materials, and concerns around decontextualized representation that is harmful or misleading abound. In an article by David Swenson, Rebecca Engelman, and Troy Geist, published in our Teaching with Folk Sources special double issue of the Journal of Folklore and Education in 2023, they describe a project repatriating and reintroducing Lakota and Dakota songs of the Standing Rock Reservation from Francis Densmore's collection of more than 2,500 American Indian songs recorded between 1907 and 1941. They write, quote, Densmore's work, along with other available ethnographic materials, represent an opportunity for reclaiming heritage and culture and for teaching difficult or unknown histories. Teaching with primary sources reveals very complex influences: gender, gender roles, familial relationships, language barriers, language translation, changes in technology for good or bad, politics, and above all, reclamation and hope for a voice to be heard, to shape and guide those very materials. These influences are revealed to a great extent in the groundbreaking work that ensued with original Lakota and Dakota songs that Densmore recorded, and with this current project repatriating the music back to the Lakota, end quote. This is a segue into what I will focus most of my time upon then. This was our opportunity. The Local Learning Teaching with Folk Sources project engages this tension and flips it into opportunity. How might learners of all ages, because we find we need to start with the teachers and the adults first, how do they find meaningful opportunities for scholarship and research in primary sources closest at hand, while also cultivating healthy literacy skills that respect and contextualize the cultural content? The key to engaging this opportunity at hand lies within the methodologies honed through folk arts education. Namely, we start with the premise that stories matter and have worth in the classroom. Stories may take the form of oral histories, interviews, photos, art, music, or any of the other many formats through which narrative emerges. To see a story as educationally significant that is written through a hip-hop lyric, a hooked rug, an oral history of a local event, or one of the many other items we have amplified in Teaching with Folk Sources materials offers a useful premise. Opportunities to learn exist outside of mandated curricula text. Yet, these folk sources remain unknowable without tools to read them and to discover their meanings. To build literacy for these diverse narrative platforms, we engage a holistic pedagogy that uses thinking routines such as Harvard Project Zero's See, Think, Wonder, very similar to the Library of Congress's tool, Observe, Reflect, Question. Yet, how do we teach students to see beyond their own cultural lens? What happens when you align the idea of thinking to inventory your assumptions And then, how might inquiry develop once aligned with these strategies that include close reflection and awareness? In fact, the strategy as employed by local learning ends up looking more like the following. So, to remind you, thinking about observe, reflect, question, or see, think, wonder, we'll start with describe. Using the senses that are appropriate, please, we're not looking old photos, describe the item. If it's oral, what do you hear? If it's visual, what do you see? If it's tactile, what do you feel? Ensure that your notes are only describing what you observe, not what you think or what you believe. Then, inventory your assumptions. Here you must consider, how does your own experience of that item influence your interpretation of that item? Some prompts that might help you understand how to inventory your assumptions include: 1, how do you connect with the community or culture from where the item comes? In which ways might you not relate? How does your prior knowledge or belief inform your thinking? How do you think it looks? Good or bad, pretty or ugly? Now also, go back to your description note above. Are any of your notes actually about what you think rather than strict descriptions of the item? Sasha Antonin wrote in her introduction to our special issue on teaching with folk sources, quote, "A folk source is a provocation to recognize that every person, every group, and every institution have a specific vantage point and position that they speak from. Some might call this personal or cultural bias, but I want to suggest that bias, when used reflexively, can be a useful tool. To recognize bias is an opportunity to inventory one's assumptions and reflect on how and where one got them." And then going through this process, then we end up at this inquiry moment. Reviewing what you know from your description, reflecting upon what you think, or you might be a little biased about, or just be blind to, due to your prior knowledge or your cultural lenses. Develop questions that you now have about the item. What makes you curious? What kinds of connections do you need to better understand in order to interpret this item or connect it to other parts of your research or curriculum? Engaging this process, I argue, directly addresses the way bias interrupts learning across difference. It creates ways for better knowing oneself as a student and as a cultural being who exists in the world. The more we understand our own position and positionality, the better we are situated to be thoughtful about approaching those things that have a cultural context outside our own. By asking questions of, are we an insider or an outsider to this? Or potentially knowing that because we belong or don't, we might also begin to assert the importance of recognizing diversity even within groups that may at first seem homogeneous. Patty Bowman and Lynn Hamer wrote in their introduction to the anthology Through the Schoolhouse Door that problems arise when educators are not aware of the partial nature of their own cultural knowledge and then consider it, quote, objectively normal and thus right in school because teachers are in charge. Educator Shirley Bryce Heath described this earliest in Ways with Words, arguing that the lack of success for some students could be attributed to the fact that they come from a different community than their teachers, and their ways with words were too often considered wrong. So, using oral history, place-based learning methodologies that affirm students' multiple cultural knowledges through dialogical and reciprocal practices, alongside folk source texts that reflect diverse community knowledges and points of view, it can transform learning. Folk arts education requires educators to build student scaffolding that encourages a serious considerations of one's own positionality and assumptions that inform all that is seen, how we think, and the kinds of questions that seem most useful. Additionally, this scaffolding provides guidance that is personalized to each student. Who they are impacts the questions they see as important. This realization then serves as one of the ethical building blocks to being able to work with folk sources. So let's consider an example we developed to share this with teachers and students. The screenshots from the Library of Congress website is the landing page for the Occupational Folklife Project, a project many of you know through the efforts of Nancy Gross and others. And What we like about it at Local Learning, it helps expand definitions of culture beyond ethnicity. Now we look at occupation. Already you might be using our methodology to assess content. What do you see? What do you wonder? When we introduce teachers to the same screenshot, in our curriculum guide, we also include call-out blurbs throughout that first lesson in order to create opportunities for learning, even when you didn't know that you had a question. In this slide, you can see the screenshot from our curriculum guide where we both introduce the topic of occupational folk life, but make sure we don't assume that a teacher will know what we mean by a collection. As an aside, folklore field workers across the US have recorded more than 1,800 audio and audiovisual oral history interviews with workers in a score of trades, industries, crafts, and professions through the Occupational Folklife Project. The completed interviews have been incorporated into the American Folklife Center archive here at the Library of Congress. And in our next curriculum that we're working on right now, Patty Bowman and the Local Learning team is specifically exploring the theme of work and play. So, one example of a primary source from the Occupational Folklife collection is this image. Now, as you look at this image, hopefully you can see it, just think to yourself, what is it that I think I'm seeing as I look at this pin? How would I describe it? Just think to yourself. What assumptions? I'm going to go quickly through this. It's supposed to be a lecture, even though I'm always so tempted to make this super interactive. It's really hard not to. So inventory your assumptions. What is it that you might be thinking as you look at this pin? Is there something that it reminds you of? What kinds of questions would you be asking? Of course, additional context can come as we look at the caption for the pin. The caption, an Iron Workers Union Local number 63 pin honoring work on the Chicago bean. So it gives you a little bit of additional information. All of a sudden you're like, oh, that shape. Maybe you were thinking jelly bean. You wouldn't have been that far off. So within this collection, we can discover that this photo is one of 35 images connected to an audio file, an interview with a living member of IWU number 63, Richard Rowe, conducted by Clark Douglas Hawker, or as many of us know him as Bucky Hawker. Taking time to review the photos and associated captions offers students an opportunity to begin assessing the context of the item they are both connected to, the interview. I'm going to play a 2-minute excerpt offering one union member's perspective about how unions fought for an 8-hour day, the steelworkers making the first Ferris wheel for the Chicago's World Fair, and the formation of unions through and across ethnic lines. Let's take a listen.
When word came that Chicago was going to host the World Columbian Exposition in 1893, word came down in about 1890 that we had won this competition, 1890, 1891. And all of these little shop locals or shop unions decided to band together, and they founded the Architectural Ironworkers Union of Chicago. Mm-hmm. That union had 1,500 members. They had so many members that they split it up into three separate locals. They were an independent union, non-affiliated with anybody. They were the Architectural Ironworkers Union of Chicago, and it had 3 locals. One local conducted their business in English, one in German, and one in Bohemian. Yeah. So you had the 3 separate locals under the one umbrella that was non-affiliated. Yeah. They went on strike for the 8-hour day in 1892, and they were crushed. Yeah. They lost the strike, the union was crushed. They reorganized in 1893 under a fellow by the name of O.H. Hill, and this time, again, we went on strike, and this was during the building of the World's Columbian Exposition. And there was workers that were working on the big Ferris wheel, George W. Ferris's observation wheel that he called it. So they're working on a Ferris wheel and all the different buildings for the World Columbian Exposition. And this time we won recognition for a union, and we won the 8-hour day, and we won recognition from a...
And it goes on. But you notice that clip in less than 2 minutes, takes us and students on this journey from 1892 to a Ferris wheel, which so many students know. It helps us think about like the power of moving from 3 separate unions speaking 3 separate languages to working together, to winning this thing called an 8-hour day, which might be familiar. The rest of the interview, if you kept going, it's so rich. You're gonna be learning about the Haymarket Square riot, international workers of the world, significant architectural advances in mortar, cast iron, and steel. It's all throughout the rest of this interview. And then, of course, this image, also from the archive, students might recognize, already as they had looked at that image of the pin, that this is the Chicago bean. And I should mention, I'm from Oak Park. So Chicago is like where I'm from. As we talk about the idea of connecting to the local, of course, this story reaches out to me. I'm like, this is what we see when we go downtown every time. So the Chicago Bean, officially known as Anish Kapoor's Cloud Gate, it's a well-known destination in Millennium Park for tourists and residents. So realizing that something experienced today links to over 100 years of occupational labor history, that's our starting point, right? To understand that primary sources can prove powerful in offering multiple perspectives and new voices for challenging history. Our curriculum guide offers scaffolding to discover learning with folk sources like these items above. But how do we find this? Which ones prove the most effective for teaching? How do we begin to imagine the ways in which local resources can connect to the archives held at the Library of Congress? It may at first be instructive to realize that the collections of the American Folklife Center do actually reflect the local at every turn. As you begin to discover the possible resources of the AFC, you find from lullabies to work songs, Zora Neale Hurston to rural postal workers, items that come from someplace and reflect that local community, items that have a story to tell. Then, once you frame folk sources as multiple kinds of narratives that require literacy for deeper understanding, you also begin to see how these folk sources create deep connections through local archives to the nation. Here are some tips that our team has developed to illuminate the connections that exist across archival collections without minimizing unique local content into generalities or reducing items' meanings into digestible tidbits. To paraphrase Ruth Behar, the job of the ethnographer is to make a person's life too big to easily consume or understand. Likewise, rather than miniaturize or contain, teaching with folk sources names the complexities of stories, sits with tensions and outright contradictions, and encourages the use of inquiry for deeper understanding of the item in question. So here's a couple of our tips. 1, start small. It will grow on its own. If you have a local collection that you want to work with, identify a small primary source set of a few images, clips, or items that you find particularly interesting or useful. And then after you identify, too, these items to work with, think about the deeper context in which these items are situated. Think thematically, culturally, geographically, seasonally. There's so many categories. As you assess the context of the items, think about how the items might potentially help you meet your learning goals and/or particularly name which items you want to amplify through this project, and also note what you might not know about the context. What questions do you have? There's a lot of other tips we provide in our guides for teachers, but I have to add, of course, and we're here, ask a librarian. The LOC offers direct access to librarians via their website. The responses are often swift, helpful, and interesting. Don't be afraid to reach out. And so here I have to shout out Guha Shankar, who's been our most helpful librarian for a lot of our project, and John Fenn, who has been key to some of the thinking that we've been doing. So the local learning project partners often have community collections that they want to bring into conversation with the archives held at the American Folklife Center and the Library of Congress. Teaching with Folk Sources places this conversation at the center of our work. It is in facilitating dialogue between the local and the national, between the stories held in community and the stories that are amplified by the Library of Congress, we begin to build a deeper, more inclusive narrative of what is meant by we the people. If you want to see your local art, expertise, and stories move from your archive shelves and digital files into classrooms, libraries, community spaces, and museums, the activity and curriculum of teaching with folk sources activates and amplifies this conversation. For example, Andy Kolovis from Vermont Folklife shared a quote from a 2001 interview with Diana High School. Quote, "Vermont has 3 months of winter and 9 months of darn poor sledding." Our lesson plan that we crafted along with Mary Wesley then built on a seasonal round that local learning has been using for years, but with a twist. We brought hexagonal thinking into the mix, asking for students to find the conversations between folk sources from the Vermont archives and those we curated from the Library of Congress's collections that amplified seasonal activities. We brought some exemplars to our poster session at the National Council for Social Studies meeting in Boston, and teachers found themselves making multiple connections and explaining how these are connected. Do you know what I mean by hexagonal thinking? So you have the hexagons, and you can build perhaps a long chain of connections, like, oh, this is connected to this, which is connected to this. Or you might build clusters of meaning, and all around a hexagon, all of a sudden you found all these other sources, and you start to have to name, what is that theme? How is that working for me? And the teachers, as they started to build with these different images on the hexagons to explain and reflect, all of a sudden we are smack dab in the middle of the pedagogy. How do we teach and learn with these folk sources? But do you notice in this picture the woman listening to her phone in the photo at this poster session? You're like, oh, phones continue to distract. Well, keep looking. Does she seem distracted? We actually put QR codes on some of the hexagons, inviting folks to listen to the interviews. We have learned that the aspect of folk sources that can prove most challenging to teaching is actually that listening can matter. And listening to ethnographic interviews can prove powerful in accessing and teaching with these primary sources. So let's consider in this an example of how we can make a case for folk sources. So I'm going to pull this up. So on this slide, on the left, we have a poster designed by artist Lester Bial for the Rural Electrification Administration. Take a minute to just look at the choices made by the artist. Think about who their audience might be and what that artist is trying to communicate. And then on the right, take a minute and read to yourself this transcript of an interview that Vermont Folklife did with Gussie Laverne in 1994. I'll give you a minute just to read this transcript. You can already see some connections. You're like, oh, yeah. She's talking about a house on the hill. That feels like actually really related. But then let's consider, how does the fact that this is an ethnographic audio recording enhance what we are seeing here and what we're reading through a transcript? What's the difference between a transcript and the audio item from the archive? Let's listen.
In 1935, I believe it was, I was a senior in high school. We had electricity put into the farm. And this Charlie Patrick was the one that was the electrician. And we would be asking him every day when we came home from school, are you going to turn it on yet? We were so excited. I don't think I can tell about it. I was so excited. So I was coming home from school, and I had stayed for basketball practice. And we lived about 1.5 miles from Heinsberg Village, and the farmhouse was kind of is up on a hill. And it was just all lit up. The barns and the house, every light was on. And it was just like, just a spectacular sight. And I'd run a little ways, and then I'd cry. I was so excited that I can't talk about it. So excited about we had electricity, couldn't believe it.
Wow, right? What does it mean to put our local stories and voices in conversation with the materials at the American Folklife Center and the Library of Congress? And why does the time that it takes to get these clips that you can listen to and to actually teach how to listen matter? Then I listened to this clip and I'm blown away. So, likewise, Vermont Folklife's completed interviews with Mi'kmaq Searing, a first-generation Tibetan-American musician, dancer, teacher, and community leader. Searing shared songs and stories that illustrated his belief that music and dance are essential to cultural identity and community well-being. In one interview excerpt, he describes being at work and singing a song to make the work easier. He suspects his joy earned him a promotion. That theme, then, of a work song immediately sparks this notion that there are numerous examples of work songs in the AFC collections. We particularly focus on a recording by Stetson Kennedy of John Henry from 1939. A new conversation about how we work is born across time and geography. And while the interviews with Searing from the past 5 years, our partners in Oklahoma at the Oklahoma Oral History Research Project and the OSU libraries were reviewing their archival materials collected to the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Perhaps one's first instinct would be to look for other items at the Library of Congress that specifically connect to this event. However, this inquiry led to a consideration of how civil rights has been a core conversation in Oklahoma since before its statehood. We asked, how are community needs being met through teaching with these primary sources? We collaborated with hip-hop producer and historian Dr. View to learn more about how he used primary sources in the creation of the Fire in Little Africa album. We listened to survivor narratives collected by Eddie Faye Gates. And then Dr. Autumn Brown did a deeper dive into the AFC Civil Rights History Project, which revealed interviews that had been completed with 2 children of the Oklahoma civil rights icon and teacher Clara Looper. This material offered deeper insights into multiple perspectives available through oral history into complex time periods and histories. So I just wanted to share a couple of small examples from our work on how primary sources that come from ethnography and oral history to access diverse perspectives on topics that have significance for the hyper-local, yet can extend to deep global and historical connections. And clearly, folk sources can spark curiosity and offer opportunities for inquiry. As I think about Gussie's interview, I'm reminded that folk sources can teach us new narratives about a time, a place, or an event. Folk sources can also complicate a story in necessary ways, like Fire in Little Africa. And considering the stories that you might find in the archives, be prepared for new insights, additional and sometimes conflicting perspectives, and significantly fuller narratives to emerge. It starts with just one item or one set of primary sources, and from there, the world opens up. The process of ethnography and documentation provides tools for ethical collaboration and connection within communities. The products of this process matter because they are texts that are necessary for deeper understanding of ourselves, our many communities, and our multiple histories. Also, this isn't just about a record for people who didn't experience that event, that place, or that time. Primary sources save things for communities. People may have access to their own story that otherwise is lost or not amplified through formal education or in dominant narratives. Youth pay attention to what is valued by society, and seeing a record of their community stories as texts that should be taught matters. I love seeing this chart by Linda Deffenbaugh that clearly outlines the meaningful connections between folk arts education, ethnographic inquiry, and, as I've outlined today, how the products of ethnography, the folk sources, prove meaningful in teaching and learning. As a National Arts Service Organization for Folk Arts and Education, local learning recognizes that educators, artists, and citizens face contemporary challenges that require their creativity, research, and empathy. We see teachers as one of the first responders. They create safe learning spaces for students who bring news of the next crisis with them through the school door, from climate migration and those escaping violence, to those directly affected by societal injustice, generational trauma, and political destabilization. Likewise, the critical literacy needed to discern folklore's cultural texts will be most effective if started with our youngest learners, followed by university and graduate level work in emergent theoretical frameworks reflective of the inherently dynamic nature of folk life. The methodologies that we've been working with provide key mechanisms for supporting education that matters in the light of global and diverse challenges, because our toolkits provide access to cultural knowledge, methods to document and learn from local experts, and models to inform next steps to strengthen communities, build resilience, and/or inform advocacy. Ultimately, my argument here today is that teaching with folk sources matters, because critical analysis of these texts offer opportunities to consider significant topics in social studies, literacy, and civics, like subject position, multiple truths, the complexity of memory, and the ways we need all these diverse and sometimes contradictory stories to understand where we have been to better chart our future. So now, here we are at the end of the talk, and you might say to yourself, what about innovation? I was promised to talk about education, innovation, and the American Folklife Center archives. You absolutely experienced educational connections made by the local learning team to connect teachers and students to the rich collections of the AFC. Likewise, we experienced a small fraction of the AFC archives throughout the talk. But innovation? Here's the radical thesis I want to leave you with all today. The innovation lies within human creativity, the story, the folk. I know we're hearing a lot about technology as being the same as innovation. The races to the future that require specialization at the expense of what? Context, humanity, how it fits within the long story? No. The innovation, and dare I say transformational opportunity, is to activate this work in ways that centers student agency and inquiry, fosters critical thinking with robust mechanisms for naming things that may seem invisible to many. In fact, I've often quipped when people ask, but what does a folklorist do, really? And I'll say, we make those things that may be invisible more visible. From stories that are encoded within culture, to patterns that keep us safe or warn others away, to seeing systems that are so blindingly normative that those within don't even know they are complying to systemic demands. That is where the innovation lies. Thank you.
That was great. Would you take a few questions?
Sure.
Questions? Oh, okay, hang on.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I wondered whether or not you could share a little bit about the rollout of the materials and seeing, because I think one thing you mentioned in your discussion was that it starts with the teachers, it starts with the educators in terms of them actually being the students in this curriculum. And then I oftentimes wonder how it lands with the students because, you know, generational differences in some ways, especially certain age groups, maybe they don't want to get to better know themselves. You know, I mean, I just wondered whether or not you've been getting early reactions and modifications to the curriculum based on just how it lands on different age groups and different, you know, where they are in life to orient to this idea of folk.
I love that. And so we have been working with teachers kind of throughout to pilot this work in the classrooms and to better understand, like, how is this received? What matters? And what we have been hearing back is that because we are emphasizing, like, paying attention to the local in relation to this work, that there's often a pathway for students to feel like they can connect to the work, which ends up being the most important thing. Actually, in Vermont, they were looking at the civil rights history curriculum that we've been putting together in Oklahoma. And I was like, oh, this is interesting that they want to pilot that in Vermont. And the teacher said, yeah, but it gave us this great opportunity. The students began to research who are the civil rights icons in Vermont. And then they used, and so instead of using Clara Luper, they started in Vermont. And so they first did the research in order to access the primary sources in order to make meaning. And what I have noticed in what's happening through our curriculum, and it takes the teachers that want to do this, it actually starts with the research. And how can we make the students more curious about these topics, and like, how do I fit within this? And now they're ready to access the primary sources because it makes sense. Like, we've given them a platform in which to engage it and to help make meaning from it.
Question?
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much for your talk. So one of the things I really appreciate about your project is your emphasis on oral histories, oral sources, and that sort of emotional impact of listening to history. You mentioned how you sort of curate and the time your team devotes to finding those tidbits. And I wondered, what is your methodology for that selection? What kinds of criteria do you sort of look for when you hear something in the archive and you're like, oh, that would make for a really meaty, inclusion in our curriculum?
I wish I had an easy answer for that. This is the time-consuming, challenging thing for our team and for a lot of others. There's so much. And even though here I am saying, what you hear can be so different from the transcript, make sure you listen to it. A lot of times we'll start with the transcripts. And you start skimming through the transcripts and like, where are the meaty parts that thematically or geographically or even just like through vocabulary begin to like connect with what we're trying to do. And then you start to listen. We know that like 2 minutes, 3 minutes max is what's gonna work in a classroom. We've been working with Andy Kolovis and have a little website called folksources.org where we've been collecting kind of useful teacher sound bites to hopefully kind of create a space that is stable for some of the clips that we have made for teaching. But in terms of that discovery thing, I think that's our biggest challenge because it takes a lot of time. But even as I'm talking, let me add this. I started the paper here, and I'm gonna say it again. This is such a team effort. So like, if this was just Lisa Rathje trying to pull this together, it wouldn't look like this, and it wouldn't feel like this, and importantly, it wouldn't sound like this. It's because we're working with local archivists and field workers, and also asking them, so, what's the interview that you think is most special? What's the story that stuck with you way past that moment when you heard that story the first time? Let's make sure we amplify that and pay attention to that. And almost every field worker that you talk to is gonna know what that story might be. And so then it's just our job to find that story through the finding aids, through the transcripts, to be able to like make it that manageable piece. But at the same time, as I said, let me say, like, we don't want these stories to just be about rural electrification, right? Like, we want this to invite more questions. Makes you want to go know more about that time, that place, that person. Let's leave with more questions than answers.
Hi. When you're making the this program, where do you start with making the connections? Is it with the local archivists or the teachers? What's the process like for that?
So we are starting with the local almost entirely. And what is it within their collections that they are most interested in being able to amplify? Or what is the thing that they're most kind of concerned by? And how can we pay attention to that? So yeah, when we were working with Washington State Parks, we ended up doing a project that started with Mount St. Helens because they had all these oral history materials that they wanted to talk about. But then it ended up really looking at like kind of ecology and understanding climate change. And that ended up being some really interesting questions that, again, primary sources help us kind of place the human in a story that can feel like overwhelming to so many students. But we started with what are the stories that you want to like particularly pay attention to in your particular space? So we have worked with New York Folklore and the Seneca Nation as one of our local partners, History Miami Museum, Washington State Parks, Vermont Folklife, of course, and Oklahoma State University. So in each of those, that's why each collection that we've pulled together looks super different because they have different questions, they have different needs. The teachers are looking for something different.
Any more questions? Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Rathje for coming and for a wonderful talk. And thank you all for being here.